Vivian Monroe stood at the narrow window of her senior housing unit and looked out at the parking lot below. She was 69 years old, though her hands, the same hands that had guided millions of pencils toward proper letter formation, that had wiped away thousands of tears, that had written encouraging comments on report cards for nearly 4 decades, still moved with the gentle confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Her close-cropped silver-gray hair framed her face with natural grace. The round, gold-rimmed glasses that had become as much a part of her as her slow, warm Georgia accent sat perched on her nose, the lenses catching the pale afternoon light filtering through the thin curtains. Behind those glasses were eyes that had seen beauty in every child who ever walked into her classroom, and later, her office as principal. She wore a soft lavender cotton blouse tucked into dark gray slacks, a charcoal wool cardigan draped over her shoulders like a familiar friend. Everything about her spoke of dignity, of a life lived with intention, of grace under circumstances that might have broken someone less resilient. The window was small, and what lay beyond it was not particularly inspiring. A rectangle of asphalt, perhaps 15 parking spaces, the dumpster area cordoned off by a chain-link fence, a single, scraggly oak tree that seemed to be struggling as much as Vivian was. But she could see, if she craned her neck just slightly, the corner of the street where a bus line ran, and beyond that, the very top of a church steeple, several blocks away, its white painted wood catching sunlight and seeming to promise something larger than this immediate view, something transcendent, something worth looking toward, even when your immediate circumstances suggested that transcendence was impossible. She had moved into this apartment 8 months ago, after her retirement. It was affordable, which mattered more than anything else at this point in her life. The rent was $900 a month. Her pension provided about $1,200. Her Social Security added another $1,800. That gave her $3,000 a month in income, $900 for rent, $250 for utilities and internet, $150 for her car insurance and gasoline. That left about $1,700 for food, medications, personal items, and any emergencies that might arise. It was tight. It was survivable, but only barely. It was not the retirement she had imagined when she was 25 years old and first became a teacher, full of idealism, and assuming that a full career in education would lead to security and dignity in her later years. The senior housing unit was clean but sparse. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbors' television sets through the drywall, a constant murmur of voices and canned laughter that formed the soundtrack of her days. The furniture was minimal, a bed she kept immaculately made, a small table where she took her meals, a dresser with a mirror, and a single comfortable chair by the window where she sat in the afternoons. On the dresser sat a small collection of photographs in cheap frames. Vivian and her husband James on their wedding day in 1972, both of them young and radiant. James again, holding newborn Darren in the hospital. Lisa as a toddler in a yellow sundress, her father's hands steady and large around her small waist. The whole family at a church picnic sometime in the 1980s, before James got sick. But the most treasured photograph, the one that lived in her top drawer beneath a silk scarf, was a black and white image of her Aunt Odessa taken sometime in the 1960s. Odessa stood in front of the one-room schoolhouse that would eventually become Vivian's inheritance, her dark eyes looking directly at the camera, with unmistakable intelligence and quiet pride. Vivian had spent 38 years in education. She started as a first-grade teacher in 1969, fresh out of Atlanta's Spelman College with a degree in elementary education and a heart full of dreams about changing the world one child at a time. For the first 15 years, she taught first grade at Robert E. Peach Elementary School in Atlanta, a school that served primarily black families in a neighborhood that had been redlined for decades, that was underfunded and under-resourced, but filled with children who deserved with their whole hearts to know that they mattered, that they were brilliant, that their futures were not predetermined by the zip code they'd been born into. Vivian became known for staying late, for reading to students one-on-one, for visiting homes, for calling parents who missed conferences, for buying supplies out of her own paycheck because the school's budget couldn't cover crayons and construction paper. Parents wanted their children in her class. Teachers asked her for advice. The principal noticed her. When Vivian was 38 years old, she was asked to become an assistant principal. When she was 42, she was promoted to principal. She moved to Westside Elementary, a school even more challenged than Peach, a school where the graduation rate was 42%, where fights broke out in the hallways, where students came to school hungry and traumatized. Vivian changed the culture. She knew every child's name within 2 weeks of arriving. She established a breakfast program. She created a mentorship system where older students worked with younger ones. She instituted thinking breaks where students could go to a quiet room instead of being suspended for behavioral issues. She started a garden project where students grew vegetables, learned biology, and had healthy food to take home. She established relationships with local colleges and created internship pipelines. Over 10 years, the graduation rate climbed to 87%. Test scores improved. College acceptances increased by 300%, and Vivian Monroe became known as the principal who made the impossible possible, who believed in children when nobody else did, who showed them their own worth through her unwavering faith in them. But none of this happened in a vacuum. It happened while she was raising 2 children alone after her husband, James, died of heart disease when Darren was 19 and Lisa was 16. James had been a good man, a dependable man, a man who went to work every day at the manufacturing plant and came home tired but satisfied with the work of his hands. He had died on a Tuesday, during his afternoon shift, without warning, a heart attack in the factory, and then he was gone. Vivian had been 38 years old. She had 27 years left in her career, but they would be 27 years without the person who balanced her, who made her laugh, who held her at night and reminded her that she was human and not just a teacher, just a principal, just a mother trying to hold everything together alone. Those were the years when Vivian learned what resilience really meant. It wasn't just persistence. It was the ability to show up day after day in grief so profound it felt like drowning, to stand in front of a classroom and engage with children's learning while your own child was home alone after school, to work double shifts some weeks, to tutor students on weekends, to attend night school, to get her master's degree in educational administration, because advancing in her career meant more money and more stability for her family. It was driving the kids to school, making sure they did their homework, packing their lunches, helping them navigate grief and adolescence, being both mother and father and breadwinner and mourner all at the same time. It was stretching every dollar, clipping coupons, buying clothes from Goodwill, and making it clear to Darren and Lisa that education was the only inheritance she could truly give them. "You are smart," she told them. "You are capable. Nobody can take that from you. That is the only wealth that matters." When Darren went to the University of Georgia, Vivian paid for his undergraduate degree out of pocket, saving for years. She worked summer school every single summer, not for the enrichment of learning, but for the money. Summer school paid about 15% more than the regular school year salary. That summer, money was for Darren, for books, for room and board, for the things that the academic scholarship didn't cover. She became good at saying no. No to nice dinners out, no to small luxuries, no to the vacation that other teachers took in the summer. No, the summer money was for Darren's future. When he came home one summer and announced that he wanted to get an MBA from Georgia Tech, Vivian didn't hesitate, though her heart did skip a beat at the cost. $80,000. How was she going to do this? She was in her 50s now, and her retirement account was growing, but not fast enough for this. She did the math. She took out a loan against her retirement account. She worked extra shifts during the school year, tutoring students after school, preparing materials on weekends. She went without new clothes for 3 years. She drove her 10-year-old car until it almost died, and then drove it for another 3 years more. She paid for his MBA from Georgia Tech, $73,000 in total. And when he graduated, when he walked across the stage with his new degree, when he got hired at a good salary at a tech company in Atlanta, she felt the weight lift. She had done it. She had given him the inheritance she could give, not land, not money accumulated over generations, but education, access to opportunity, a pathway out of struggling. When Lisa decided to attend Howard University 2 years later, Vivian made the same commitment, knowing the cost. Howard was a good school, a historically black university with prestige and networks that would serve Lisa well. It was also expensive, $78,000 for Lisa's undergraduate degree. By this time, Vivian had rebuilt her retirement savings somewhat, but not enough. She borrowed against her retirement account again. She promised herself this was the last time, that after this, she would focus on her own security. After Lisa, no more loans, no more sacrifices. But when Lisa wanted to buy a house at age 28, when she was excited about the prospect of home ownership, and when Vivian understood that real estate was something that built equity and created generational wealth, Vivian broke her promise to herself. She co-signed a mortgage. She gave Lisa $30,000 as a down payment gift that she had to withdraw from her retirement savings. That withdrawal, that gift, that moment when she prioritized her daughter's down payment over her own financial security in her later years would turn out to be the most consequential financial decision of her life. Darren became a mid-level marketing manager at a tech company in Atlanta. He made a good salary. Vivian wasn't sure exactly how much, but his Instagram showed a comfortable life. He drove a nice car, a Mercedes SUV, and lived in a house in Brookhaven that Vivian had helped him buy after his divorce from his first wife. He married twice and divorced twice. The marriages were brief, neither lasting more than 6 years. The second wife seemed nice, but Vivian met her only once, at a Christmas dinner that felt awkward and strained. He had a daughter from his first marriage, a girl named Maya, who Vivian adored and whom she took care of during the summers and on weekends when Darren had custody. Vivian bought her school supplies, helped with her homework, took her to the library and to the park and to age-appropriate movies. She developed a relationship with Maya separate from Darren, a grandmother-like bond. But then Darren got custody full-time, and he stopped bursing her around. Vivian asked why. "Mom, it's complicated," he said. "Siobhan and I are trying to focus on just the two of us right now, and Maya needs stability." Vivian heard what he wasn't saying, that her relationship with his daughter was somehow threatening, that perhaps Vivian was trying to undermine his authority, that her presence was a complication rather than a blessing. After that, he stopped bringing Maya to Vivian's birthday dinners. He didn't answer when Vivian texted about Maya's school achievements, her basketball team, her excellent science fair project. The door to that relationship closed quietly, and Vivian was left standing on the other side, knowing she had been excluded, but not knowing how to fight back. Lisa became an interior designer. She was good at it, had an eye for color and composition, could walk into a space and see its potential, could transform a room. She married once and it stuck. She and her husband, Marcus, had 2 children, Emma and Jaden. They made decent money combined, but Lisa always seemed to be stretched thin. The private school tuition for the kids, the mortgage on the house in Buckhead, the health insurance, the car payment, the repairs that never seemed to end. Always something. And Lisa would call her mother with financial stress. And Vivian, even though she was retired and living on a fixed income, would find a way to help. A check here, a loan there, paying off a credit card balance, just this once, helping with property tax payments when there was an unexpected expense. It was never asked for directly. Lisa was too proud for that, but the subtext was clear. And Vivian, who had spent her entire life helping, who believed that this was what mothers did, continued to give even when she couldn't afford to. Vivian retired at 67. The school threw her a party. 200 people came. Students she had taught in first grade, now 20, 30, 40 years old, came back to celebrate her. They had become teachers, doctors, lawyers, business owners, nurses, social workers, professors. They had become people who made a difference in the world, and they credited her. "Ms. Monroe believed in me when nobody else did," said a woman who was now a pediatric surgeon. "Ms. Monroe came to my house when I was thinking about dropping out, and she sat at my kitchen table and told me I was too smart to give up," said a man who was now an engineer. Teachers she had mentored came, now principals and coaches and instructional specialists in their own right, carrying forward the philosophy that Vivian had instilled in them. See children, believe in children, fight for children. Parents she had counseled came, now grandparents themselves, remembering how Vivian had listened to them, had asked about their home lives, had treated them as partners in their children's education rather than obstacles. The superintendent gave a speech about her legacy, about her impact, about the generations of students who had been changed because she had committed her entire professional life to them. There was a scholarship fund established in her name, the Vivian Monroe Excellence in Teaching Scholarship, to be given each year to a teacher in the school system who demonstrated exceptional dedication to students. Vivian received flowers and gifts and cards and embraces and tears and gratitude. It was beautiful. It was everything a retirement should be. And then she went home to her apartment and looked at her bank account and realized she had less than $30,000 left. $30,000. After 38 years of work, after countless summers spent teaching summer school, after never taking vacations, after driving used cars and buying clothes at Goodwill. She had less than $30,000. Her retirement savings, which should have been substantial, had been depleted by her children's dreams. She did the math, trying not to panic. She had a pension, about $1,200 a month. She had Social Security, which would be about $1,800 a month. That was $30,000 a year. The apartment was $900 a month. That left about $21,000 for everything else, which was survivable, but only barely. There was no cushion for medical emergencies, no buffer for unexpected expenses, no possibility of any life beyond survival. This was what the future looked like. This was the cost of her choices. She did the math carefully. Social Security would give her about $1,800 a month. Her pension from the school system would add another $1,200. That was $3,600 a month. The senior housing unit cost $900. Food, medications, utilities, a car payment. She didn't have much left. She had made a choice years ago to give everything to her children. She didn't regret it, but she also didn't know how she would survive. Darren called her once a month, usually on a Sunday afternoon. The calls were brief. "Hi, Mom, how are you?" asked in a tone that suggested he hoped the answer would be short. She would tell him she was fine, that she was keeping busy, that she'd started volunteering at the library. He would tell her he was busy, that work was crazy, that he hadn't had time to visit. He would check his phone while they talked. She could hear the little notification beeps in the background. He would say, "Well, Mom, I should go. I have some things I need to catch up on." And then he would hang up. Sometimes she didn't hear from him for 6 weeks. She would call him and his voicemail would say his mailbox was full. She would text him that she loved him, and he would respond 3 days later with a thumbs-up emoji. Lisa called less often. She sent a gift card to Vivian's email for Christmas, usually $100 to a grocery store, which was kind, which Vivian was grateful for, but which also made her feel like her daughter had outsourced the work of maintaining a relationship. When Vivian invited herself to visit, Lisa would say, "Oh, Mom, now's not a good time. The kids have soccer and Emma has a recital and we're just so stretched thin." Vivian understood. She had raised children too. She knew what it was like to be overwhelmed, but she also knew that love sometimes means making time, means showing up, means putting down your phone and looking someone in the eye and saying, "I see you, I know you, you matter to me." In the spring of Vivian's 69th year, a lawyer called her. Her Aunt Odessa had died. Odessa was 91 years old and had lived alone in a small house outside of Madison, Georgia for the last decade after her husband passed and her only son moved to California. Vivian hadn't seen her aunt in probably 8 years, though they had exchanged Christmas cards every year, and Odessa's handwriting, though increasingly shaky, had always included a personal note. "So proud of you, Vivian. You are changing the world for children. That is what matters." The lawyer explained that Vivian was the sole beneficiary listed in Odessa's will. There was some property. The lawyer would send her the paperwork. The paperwork arrived 2 weeks later. Vivian sat in her apartment and read the deed. The property was a one-room schoolhouse, built in 1921, located in rural Jasper County, Georgia, about 90 miles south of Atlanta. It had been damaged in a fire sometime in the last few years. The deed noted fire damage, structural assessment required. There was no house, no other building, no land description beyond approximately 0.25 acres surrounding the schoolhouse. Vivian looked at the address and did an internet search. The satellite image showed a charred shell of a building with a collapsed roof. She called Darren immediately. Her voice was hopeful, almost silly. "Darren, Your Aunt Odessa left me a piece of property. It's in Georgia, near... That's good, Mom. Listen, I'm in the middle of something. I'll call you back, okay? He hung up before she could say more. She texted Lisa. Got news about Aunt Odessa's estate. Call me when you get a chance? Lisa responded 6 hours later. Busy with kids RN. Everything okay? Vivian called her son back that evening. Her voice was hopeful, excited even, though she tried to temper it. It's a schoolhouse, she explained. Aunt Odessa's old schoolhouse. She taught there for 40 years. I'm going to go see it next month, I think. It's in Jasper County, not too far. I was wondering if maybe you could... A schoolhouse? Like a burned-down shack? Darren's voice was already dismissive, and Vivian's heart sank because she knew this tone, had heard it before, the tone he used when she told him about her problems, the tone that said, "Why are you bringing me this? Why are you making this my problem?" Well, it's been damaged in a fire, but it was significant to Aunt Odessa. She left it to me specifically, so there might be... Mom, just let the county take it. You don't need to deal with that. It's probably worthless. It's a liability more than anything else. Do you know how much it would cost to demolish a building? Do you know about property taxes? This is complicated. But it was your Aunt Odessa's, Vivian said softly. It was important to her. She spent her whole life teaching in that schoolhouse. I thought maybe I could see it, understand what she was leaving me. Yeah, and she left it to you, which means you have to deal with it. My advice? Try to sell it if you can, or let it go. Just let the county have it. You have better things to do than go down to the middle of nowhere in a borrowed car to look at a burned-down building. That's not a use of your time, Mom. Vivian said nothing for a long moment. The silence hung between them across the phone line. Then, when's the last time you came to visit me, Darren? What? Where is this coming from? It's been almost 3 years. Your sister came by about 6 months ago, but you haven't visited since I moved into the apartment. You call once a month, and the calls take maybe 5 minutes. You're always busy. You're always in the middle of something. And now your aunt is gone, and she left me something, and I'm reaching out to my son because I'm 69 years old and I want help, and all you can tell me is that it's a problem I shouldn't have. Mom, not now, okay? I told you, I'm busy. I'm in the middle of a work thing. I'll call you next week. He didn't say he loved her. He just hung up. Vivian held the phone for a moment after he hung up, listening to the dial tone, feeling the particular pain that comes from being dismissed by your own child, from being told that your need is an inconvenience. Then she set the phone down carefully on the small table by her window. She looked out at the parking lot, at the city beyond, at the church steeple in the distance. That night, she made a decision. She would go to Jasper County. She would go alone. And she would not ask Darren for anything ever again. The realization came with a strange sense of freedom mixed with a profound sadness. She had spent 41 years as his mother, and in the end, he had made it clear that her presence, her love, her needs were simply not important to him. She spent 2 weeks preparing. She read about Jasper County, about the history of rural Georgia, about one-room schoolhouses. There was a growing literature about rural education in the Black South, about the infrastructure that had been built by teachers like Odessa, women and men who had sustained communities through decades of systematic deprivation and racism. She went to the library and requested books on Reconstruction, on the Freedmen's Bureau, on the land grants that had been promised and then stolen. She researched Odessa's background obsessively. She had been born in 1905, the daughter of a freedman and a woman whose mother had been enslaved. She had become a teacher in 1925 when most opportunities for black women were non-existent. When a black woman who wanted to teach had to be exceptionally talented and exceptionally resilient and willing to work for less pay than her white counterparts, in worse conditions, with fewer resources. She had taught in that one-room schoolhouse for 40 years until she retired in 1965. 4 decades of commitment to children in a county where nobody else was willing to build a school for black kids, where nobody else cared enough to show up. She had been the reason that hundreds of black children in that rural county had learned to read when they otherwise would have been kept illiterate by design, had learned that they mattered when the world told them they were less than human, had been given a chance at something better when the system had written them off as worthless. Vivian realized, as she read, that her aunt had done exactly what she had spent her own life doing. Odessa had been a teacher. That was her identity, her legacy, her love. And she had chosen Vivian to be the one to carry the next chapter of that work forward. Vivian packed her medium-sized brown leather suitcase with brass clasps, the same suitcase she had used for school trips when she was principal, when she would travel to conferences or visit other schools to observe their programs. She folded her lavender blouse carefully, rolled her cardigans, packed her sensible low-heeled black leather shoes. She gathered her documents, the deed, the lawyer's letter, her driver's license. She called a car rental company and reserved a sedan. On a Wednesday morning in early June, she loaded her suitcase into the car, programmed the address into her phone, and began the drive south. The drive took nearly 2 hours. Vivian drove carefully, staying in the right lane, using her turn signals, following the speed limit exactly. As she got further south and east, the landscape changed. The suburbs gave way to smaller towns. The towns gave way to open land. The road became narrower, more winding. She passed hand-painted signs for pecan orchards and fishing bait shops. She saw wildflowers along the roadsides, goldenrod and black-eyed Susans and Queen Anne's lace. The air became more humid, heavier. The smell of red Georgia clay and pine resin drifted through the car's ventilation system. Cicadas thrummed in the late afternoon heat. She passed a hand-painted sign that said, Jasper County, home of the mighty Hornets, with a high school mascot logo. The address led her to a narrow red clay road that wound through tall Georgia pines. Her phone's GPS became uncertain. The satellite image was several years old. But Vivian knew where she was going. Something in her, some ancestral knowledge passed down through Odessa, through her own mother, through generations of women who had been displaced and uprooted and who had learned to navigate landscapes, both literal and metaphorical, knew. She drove slowly, watching the pine trees open up occasionally to reveal old houses set back from the road, small family graveyards surrounded by iron fences, the architecture of rural poverty and rural resilience existing side by side. And then she saw it. The schoolhouse appeared at the end of a slight rise, sitting on a red clay hilltop surrounded by tall pines and wildflowers. Even from a distance, she could see the damage. The white clapboard walls were charred black on one side, the result of a fire that must have been intense and consuming. The tin roof had partially collapsed inward, but the stone chimney, a beautiful construction of hand-laid river rock, stood intact and unbroken, rising above the wreckage like a monument, like a promise. The front door frame still stood, though the door itself was gone. Wildflowers pushed through the collapsed roof section. Georgia pine saplings had taken root in the ruins, their small green needles a symbol of resilience and renewal. Vivian parked the car at the base of the hill and sat for a moment, her hands still on the steering wheel, Her heart was beating faster than it should. She was breathing shallowly. She felt tears beginning to form behind her glasses. She didn't know why. She hadn't known Aunt Odessa well. They had seen each other perhaps a dozen times in the last decade, had exchanged letters and cards, had talked on the phone occasionally. But as Vivian looked at the schoolhouse, at the evidence of fire and survival, at the intact chimney standing above the destruction, she felt a profound connection to her aunt, a sense that she was standing at a threshold, that something important was about to be revealed. She took off her glasses and wiped her eyes. Then she stepped out of the car, feeling the heat and humidity immediately, feeling the Georgia air settle on her skin like a living thing. She was wearing her lavender blouse and her sensible shoes. She had her brown leather suitcase in the car, and she suddenly felt absurd, prepared for a hotel stay, but arriving instead at a burned-down building in the middle of nowhere. She locked the car, pocketed the keys, and walked toward the schoolhouse. The closer she got, the more details emerged. The scorched wooden floorboards visible through the open door frame. A toppled cast-iron potbelly stove lying on its side in the interior, its black metal streaked with ash. The remains of wooden school desks pushed against one wall, their surfaces blackened, but their shapes still recognizable. The smell of old smoke, of charred wood, of something that had been consumed but not completely destroyed. The cemetery Vivian had seen in the satellite image was nearby, an overgrown plot surrounded by an iron fence, perhaps 20 graves visible under the tall grass and flowering vines, some headstones legible, many weathered smooth by time. Vivian stood at the empty door frame and looked inside. The interior was dim compared to the bright afternoon light outside. Dust motes floated in the shafts of golden light that streamed through holes in the collapsed roof section. She could almost hear the ghosts of Odessa's voice, could almost see the children sitting at those desks, could almost smell the chalk and wood smoke and the specific smell of a schoolroom where learning was happening, where minds were being opened, where futures were being created. She stepped through the door frame. The floor was solid beneath her shoes, though her footsteps released small clouds of ash. She walked slowly through the interior, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. She touched the stone chimney, running her slender fingers over the hand-laid river rocks, feeling the mortar that had been applied nearly 100 years ago, feeling the solidity of the construction. The care that had gone into building something meant to last. Vivian sat down on the floor in the middle of the ruined schoolhouse, her dark gray slacks against the ash and debris, and she cried. She cried for her aunt, for her own exhaustion, for the choices she had made that had depleted her. She cried for the children she had taught, for the children Odessa had taught, for all of the love that had been poured into the work of education without expectation of return. She cried for her son, who couldn't be bothered to visit his mother in her last years, for her daughter who sent gift cards instead of presents. She cried for the weight of survival, the weight of dignity, the weight of showing up day after day and believing that your work mattered even when the world treated you as though you were invisible. When she had finished crying, when she was empty, when her eyes were dry and her breathing had returned to normal, Vivian remained sitting in the ash in the silence. And then something occurred to her. She stood and walked to the stone chimney. She looked at it carefully, examining each rock. The stones were roughly uniform in size, fitted together with incredible precision. Her eyes followed them from the base of the chimney upward toward where it disappeared through the collapsed roof. She found the mantel area, the opening where the fireplace would have been. She counted the stones from the mantel upward on the north side of the chimney. First stone, second stone, third stone. This stone seemed to sit slightly differently than the others, seemed to protrude a fraction more. Vivian reached up and touched it. It shifted under her fingers. She tried to move it. It was loose. Vivian went back to the car and retrieved her suitcase. Inside, she had a small pen flashlight, a manicure kit that included a small flathead screwdriver, and other items meant for a civilized senior citizen's overnight stay. She took the screwdriver and returned to the chimney. Working carefully, trying not to damage the historic stonework, she began to chip away at the mortar around the loose stone. The work took time. The mortar was hard, compacted by decades, but gradually, particle by particle, the stone became looser. Sweat dripped down her forehead and behind her glasses. Her fingers ached. Dust from the mortar coated her lavender blouse. And then, with a soft grinding sound, the stone came free. Vivian carefully pulled it away from the chimney. Behind it was darkness, a sealed compartment built into the chimney's interior structure. Vivian's hands shook. She pointed her flashlight into the darkness. She saw waxed canvas, yellowed and aged, carefully folded and placed inside the compartment. She reached in carefully and removed the bundle. The waxed canvas unwrapped easily. Inside was an 1870 Freedmen's Bureau land survey, drawn by hand, showing the outline of 120 acres near Jasper County. Notations in a careful handwriting marked boundary lines and identified landmarks. There was a note in the same handwriting. Land grant to James and Sarah Monroe, dated September 1870. Stolen via fraudulent tax sale, 1912. Rightfully ours. Below that, arranged carefully in the compartment, were multiple U.S. Treasury bonds, savings bonds, Series F, Series E, different years, different denominations, some dating back to the 1960s, all of them aged and valuable. Vivian's eyes widened as she tried to count them. There were dozens of bonds purchased one or two at a time over decades, accumulating silently, gathering interest, waiting. And beneath the bonds was a letter, heavy cream-colored paper, aged but well preserved. The envelope was addressed in Odessa's handwriting, for Vivian Monroe, whom I have never stopped loving. Vivian sat on the floor again, surrounded by the ash and the debris and the ghosts of her aunt's dedication. Her hands were shaking. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, could feel the weight of history pressing down on her, could feel the presence of her aunt in this moment, in this schoolhouse, in the evidence of love and persistence that had been left for her to discover. She opened the letter carefully, as though it might disintegrate at the slightest touch. The paper was brittle but intact, aged to a soft cream color. Odessa's handwriting was shaky but legible, the penmanship of someone trained in the careful formation of letters, the handwriting of a teacher. "My dear Vivian," the letter began, "if you are reading this, I am gone. I have tried to reach out to you over the years, to explain what I have been doing, to prepare you for this moment. But I was always afraid that if I told you directly, you would try to stop me, would insist on helping me, would take the burden of this fight onto your own shoulders. I could not allow that. You have your own work to do, your own children to fight for, your own legacy to build. I have spent my life as a teacher, 52 years in that schoolhouse, from 1925 to 1977. I taught 847 children. I know this number because I kept a ledger, because I wanted to remember each one, wanted to mark that they existed, that they mattered. Each child was a world. Each child was a future. I taught so that they could read, so they could understand what had been taken from us, so they could imagine what was possible. But I also spent my life as a historian. When I was young, before I became a teacher, my father told me about the land. He told me that my grandfather, James Monroe, and his wife, Sarah, had been granted 120 acres by the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War ended. This was our chance. This was our inheritance. This was the foundation for everything we could build. Schools, homes, churches, a community. But in 1912, when I was 7 years old, my father had to leave home to find work in Atlanta. He left my mother to manage the property. The white landowners in our county systematized the theft. They would create fraudulent tax liens, claim that the property taxes hadn't been paid, sell the land at county auction for pennies. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the land was gone. My mother wept. My father never forgave himself for leaving. For decades I did nothing. I was a teacher. Teaching seemed like enough. Teaching seemed like resistance. Teaching seemed like the way forward. But as I got older, as I taught child after child and watched them struggle against systems designed to defeat them, I began to understand that teaching alone is not enough. A good education can change a mind, but a stolen inheritance changes the trajectory of generations. A stolen inheritance says, you are not worthy of building something. You are not worthy of generational wealth. You are not worthy of stability. And every child who sits in my classroom is carrying the weight of that message, even if they don't know it. So I began to research. I found the original Freedmen's Bureau survey in the archives of the State Historical Society. I tracked the fraudulent tax sale documents through courthouse records. I found the proof. It took me years. I would go to Atlanta on weekends and spend hours in archives, writing down information, photocopying documents. I became a historian detective, searching for the evidence of our theft. And I began to save. I was a teacher. My salary was never large, but I was alone, without dependents after my husband retired and we had no children. Every dollar I didn't spend, I saved. I began buying U.S. Treasury bonds, 1 bond per month, then 2. I bought them in my name, but I was really buying them for you, for the one person in our family who would understand that teaching is not enough, for the one person who had the strength and the courage to do what needed to be done. That person is you, Vivian. You never stopped teaching. You taught in classrooms and you taught as a principal. You taught by example, by courage, by showing up for children when the system had given up on them. You are the one who understands that our worth is not determined by the land we own, but that the land we own determines the future of our children. You are the one who will know what to do with this inheritance. I have enclosed a land survey and a collection of Treasury bonds. The bonds are worth approximately $650,000 in today's value. The land that was stolen from us has been developed and is now owned by several parties, but the historical claim is clear, and the legal injustice is provable. I have the name of a civil rights attorney in Atlanta, Marcus Williams, who has agreed to help with any claim against the estates that benefited from the fraudulent sale. He is expecting to hear from you. Use this inheritance, Vivian. Use it to fight for what is right. Use it to teach the next generation about their history, about the systems that were designed to destroy us, and about the ancestors who survived and resisted and left gifts for those who came after. The schoolhouse is yours now. Do with it what I could not do. Make it what it always was meant to be. I love you. I have always loved you. I see myself in you, the same straight spine, the same refusal to give up, the same belief that education can change the world. Pass this love forward to those who come after you. Your loving Aunt, Odessa Eleanor Monroe. Vivian read the letter 3 times. then held it to her chest and wept again. But these tears were different. These were tears of understanding, of being seen, of being chosen. Odessa had spent her entire life preparing this gift. Odessa had spent 70 years accumulating the evidence and the resources to right an ancient wrong. And she had believed that Vivian was the person who could carry this work forward. Vivian sat in the ruined schoolhouse as the afternoon light shifted and changed, as the shadows grew longer, as the Georgia heat began to soften slightly. She held her aunt's letter and looked at the Treasury bonds and the land survey. She thought about her choices, about the money she had given to her children, about the love she had poured out without expectation of return. She thought about her son who could not be bothered to visit, her daughter who sent gift cards. And then she thought about something Odessa had written. A good education can change a mind, but a stolen inheritance changes the trajectory of generations. She understood now why Odessa had left her the schoolhouse. It wasn't just the bonds, though they would solve her financial insecurity. It was the message. It was the evidence that Odessa had seen her, had believed in her, had passed the torch to her. It was the challenge to think beyond her own immediate survival, to think about the future, to think about the children who would come after her. It was an invitation to expand the definition of teaching beyond the classroom, to teach through justice, to teach through restoration, to teach through action. Vivian placed the bonds back carefully into the waxed canvas. She secured the land survey. She held the letter close. She stood and looked at the stone chimney, at the intact structure that had protected Odessa's gift all these years, and she whispered a small prayer of gratitude. Then she walked back to her car, loaded her suitcase into the back seat, and drove to the town of Jasper to find a hotel for the night. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of understanding what had been given to her. But tonight, she needed to rest. Tonight, she needed to sit with the magnitude of what she had discovered. Tonight, she needed to understand that her life at 69 years old was not over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The next morning, Vivian called the lawyer Odessa had mentioned. Marcus Williams's office was in downtown Atlanta, not far from where she had spent her career. His secretary recognized the name Monroe immediately and said that Mr. Williams had been expecting to hear from the family someday, we weren't sure when. Vivian made an appointment for the following week. She spent the morning photographing the land survey and the bonds with her phone camera, creating a backup record. She also photographed the schoolhouse, documenting the damage, the chimney, the interior and exterior. She marked the location of the sealed stone so that future restoration work would know exactly where to look. Then she drove back to Atlanta, back to her senior housing unit, back to her ordinary life. But nothing was ordinary anymore. She had been given a gift that was worth more than money. She had been chosen. She had been trusted with a legacy. And she knew with absolute certainty that her life's work was not finished. It was transforming into something new. When Vivian met with Marcus Williams the following week, his eyes lit up as he examined the Freedmen's Bureau survey. He held it carefully, with the reverence of someone who understood what this document meant, not just legally, but historically, personally. "This is exceptional," he said, running his fingers over the aged document with care. "This is exactly what we need. This is documentary evidence of the original land grant, which triggers federal liability. The fraudulent tax sale was documented and was used to steal property from multiple black families in this county. This county, Jasper County, lost over 10,000 acres to systematic fraud between 1900 and 1920. Your aunt's family was one of hundreds. He spent 2 hours with her, explaining the legal process in detail, the timeline, the likelihood of settlement, the precedent cases he had worked on that had been successful. He was a tall man in his 50s, a civil rights attorney who had spent his entire career fighting for historical justice on behalf of families who had been wronged during Reconstruction and the subsequent decades of systematic theft. He moved through the office slowly, deliberately, with the bearing of someone who had dedicated his life to correcting the historical record. "Your aunt," he said finally, holding the survey up to the light, "spent decades gathering this. This is not just evidence. This is love. This is a grandmother saying to her descendants, 'I see what was taken from us. I'm documenting it. I'm fighting for you, even if you don't know I'm doing it.' That's what this is." "Your aunt," he said, "spent 50 years accumulating this evidence. This is extraordinary. This shows intent, commitment, belief in eventual justice. The courts will respond to this." He took copies of everything, secured them in a file, and told Vivian he would begin the process of filing a claim against the current property owners who had purchased the developed land in good faith decades after the original theft, but who would have liability due to the historical fraud that created their chain of title. The legal case took 3 years to resolve, but it did resolve. It was a fight. The descendants of the original perpetrators and the subsequent landowners pushed back, argued that the statute of limitations should apply, claimed that this was ancient history and that nobody alive today should be held responsible for what their ancestors had done. But Marcus Williams was patient and relentless. He gathered documents. He built the case meticulously. He showed that the chain of title from 1912 onward was built on fraud, that every owner after the fraudulent sale had benefited from that original wrong, that Vivian's family had the right to redress. It took 3 years, but it did resolve. The court determined that the Monroe family's claim was valid, that a settlement needed to be paid to account for the stolen land and the generational wealth that should have been built from it, the schools that should have been built, the homes that should have been built, the businesses that should have been built, the stability that should have been passed down through generations. The settlement was substantial. The current landowners, a development company that had purchased the partially developed property in the 1980s, were ordered to pay $420,000 in settlement to the Monroe family, combined with the Treasury bonds, which had grown to $680,000 in value, and the value of the Schoolhouse property itself, which was assessed at $45,000, Vivian's inheritance came to nearly $1 million. She did not tell Darren or Lisa immediately. Instead, she moved into a small cottage on the Schoolhouse property, a modest 2-bedroom cottage that she rented from the Historical Preservation Trust that had been created as part of the settlement agreement. The cottage was simple but clean, had a small kitchen, a sitting room, a bedroom, and a small office where she could work. She could see the restored schoolhouse from her porch. She used funds from the settlement to have the schoolhouse carefully restored, working with a local historic preservation company that understood the significance of the building, that treated it with respect and care. The work took 8 months. They preserved its historic character while making it safe and functional. She installed new windows that matched the originals in style and proportion. They repaired the tin roof carefully, using materials that approximated the original specifications. They reinforced the foundation, making sure the building would stand for another 100 years. She left the stone chimney exactly as it was, undisturbed, a monument to Odessa's persistence and love, and the decades of care she had invested in protecting the evidence of historical injustice. She had a bronze plaque installed inside the restored schoolhouse, mounted on the wall near the chimney. This schoolhouse, built 1921, is dedicated to the memory of Odessa Eleanor Monroe, educator and historian, who taught in this building from 1925 to 1977, and to all of the children and families who were denied their rightful inheritance through the systemic theft of Reconstruction-era land grants. May we remember, may we teach, may we fight for justice. She turned the restored schoolhouse into a community learning center. She established a small library with books about Black history, about Reconstruction, about the Freedmen's Bureau, about the resilience and resistance of communities that had been targeted for theft and violence. She began teaching reading classes 3 days a week to local children who were struggling. She started a summer program. She brought in historians and civil rights educators. She created a scholarship fund in Odessa's name for local students going to college. When Darren finally visited, nearly a year after Odessa's death, he was shocked by the transformation. His mother, whom he had essentially left to fend for herself on Social Security in a senior housing unit, was living in a cottage on beautiful rural property surrounded by tall pines and wildflowers. The schoolhouse had been meticulously restored. He could see the fresh white clapboard, the intact roof, the gleaming stone chimney. There was a vehicle parked in the driveway, a new Ford truck, purchased with Odessa's gift. Vivian was working, teaching, building something meaningful and significant. She received him with grace and without bitterness, as though his abandonment had not wounded her, as though she had simply moved forward into her own life. "Come see what Aunt Odessa left us," she said simply, and took him by the hand to the schoolhouse. Her hand was warm and familiar, and Darren felt something shift in his chest, something like shame, something like recognition of what he had thrown away. Darren looked uncomfortable, but he followed. Vivian showed him the plaque, the library, the classroom space, the evidence of the land claim, and the legal victory. She explained what Odessa had done, the decades of research and saving, the careful accumulation of proof and resources. She told him about the settlement, about the bonds, about the inheritance, and she watched as her son's face shifted from discomfort to something approaching shame. "Mom," he said finally, "I should have been there. I should have helped you." Vivian smiled. "I know, sweetheart, but I wasn't alone. Aunt Odessa was with me. She had been with me all along. She was waiting for me to show up." She squeezed his hand. "Come and sit down. I'll show you Odessa's letter. I want you to understand what she understood. That family is not just about money or obligation. It's about faith. It's about believing in each other, even from far away, even across death. That's what Odessa did for me. That's what I'm trying to do for the children who come to this schoolhouse." Darren sat with his mother in the restored schoolhouse as afternoon light streamed through the new windows. He read Odessa's letter. He looked at the photographs of the charred ruins and the restoration process. He listened to his mother explain the legal case and the settlement. And slowly, he began to understand that his mother's life had not been diminished by the choices she had made to support him. Instead, those choices had led her to this moment, to this understanding, to this inheritance that was about more than money. It was about legacy. It was about showing up. It was about faith in the future. Vivian planted a garden where Aunt Odessa had once grown herbs. She learned to grow the same plants Odessa had grown, basil and rosemary and mint. She pressed dried herbs into small packets and distributed them to the children in her reading classes. "This is what your ancestors grew," she told them. This is what we inherited from the land they refused to be separated from. Remember this. Remember that you come from people who survived, who resisted, who built beauty in the midst of injustice. The school bell, which had survived the fire intact and which Vivian had recovered from the rubble, was installed on a post at the entrance to the restored schoolhouse. Every morning at 8 o'clock, Vivian rang it, just as Odessa had done for 52 years. The sound carried across the Georgia landscape, calling children to learning, announcing to the world that this place was sacred, that this place was a center of education and resistance and hope. And Vivian, at 72 years old, finally understood that her life had not been a series of choices that had depleted her. It had been a journey, a preparation, a slow walk toward the work she was meant to do. She had taught in classrooms for 38 years, and she had taught her children through sacrifice, showing them that love meant giving everything, showing them that education was the only inheritance that mattered, showing them the power of commitment and dedication. She had taught through example, through faith, through showing up day after day, even when it was hard, even when it hurt, even when the return on that investment seemed unclear. And now, in the restored schoolhouse on Aunt Odessa's land, she was teaching the final and most important lesson, that justice is worth fighting for, that our ancestors are with us even when we cannot see them, that their gifts are meant to be received with gratitude and passed forward to those who come after, and that we are never too old to begin the work of restoration and healing. She had spent her whole life teaching children to read. Now she was teaching them to read their history, to understand the systems that had been designed to exploit them, to see themselves as heirs to resistance and resilience. This was her last chapter. And it was the chapter she had been preparing for her entire life. It was her best one, because it was finally hers, finally for her, finally the inheritance of a woman who had given everything and who had, through her faith and her aunt's love, finally received something back. This was what justice felt like. This was what generational love felt like. This was what it meant to be fully, completely seen.